I mean, maybe the fact that it's student debt is a problem, but massive swaths of the population becoming in debt and therefore turning into slaves is not only not unnormal, it seems to be the norm in human history. I also wanted to mention, so we've talked about this multiple times from an MMT standpoint, which is the fact that if the government has the sole issuing authority of money and it causes you to have to pay a tax, it logically follows that the government has to give you a means by which to pay that tax. Now, a student debt isn't necessarily a tax, but it kind of sort of is, especially if you owe it to the federal government and you can't bankrupt out of it, right? Yep. And the entire government school apparatus drifted you toward that direction to begin with. So it's kind of sort of a tax. So, we've talked about that. This is where something like the federal transition job conversation comes in, where we say, okay, the government needs to give you a way to pay this off, to pay this tax. Well, in this case, if the government is responsible for getting you in this mess, which it is with the student debt mess, then it has to provide a way of getting it out. And, you and I have talked about backward and forward, even with all this crazy COVID spending and stuff, that the economy currently doesn't have enough private sector net savings because we've got unemployment and we've got underutilized capacity. So if we're in a cash-starved situation and we've got all these people loaded up to the gills with debt, it's very, very reminiscent of ancient Sumeria, as we've mentioned occasionally here. So we're both fans of a book called Debt: The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. Yes, in fact, both of us were. I got my copy over here too. We were flipping through it before we started the show. But in the book, David Graeber actually goes over the fact in ancient Sumeria, we're talking, like 3000 BC onward, that debt slavery was such a huge problem that it was a constant problem with the farmers, that the farmers would take out commercial debts, have a bad year, be unable to pay the debts back, and then become slaves to the person who lent them the money. And which is also a very important point to point out, that for most of human history, if you couldn't pay your debt, there were no bankruptcy laws. You just became a slave, and your family became a slave. Yeah, they just enslaved everybody. And the idea was for you to pay back, this is to be done to pay back your debt, but because the interest ran away faster than you could ever work, you were just a slave forever because there was no way to pay it back. So Sumeria regularly ran into the problem of too much of the population turned into slaves because for whatever reason or another, they weren't able to pay their debts back. And so on a regular basis, or I guess a quasi-regular basis, the ruler of ancient Sumeria would decree a jubilee where all non-commercial debts were made null and void. And I want to bring that up because it's not like this student debt thing is a new problem. I mean, maybe the fact that it's student debt is a problem, but massive swaths of the population becoming in debt and therefore turning into slaves is not only not unnormal, it seems to be the norm in human history.
Yes, and Graeber writes about that in his book, that it was a common phenomenon for millennia, and it's happened to generations and generations of people over and over. And it's not necessarily always as easy as saying, well, they made a bad decision, so they need to suffer for it. In some cases, first of all, as we've discussed before, the banking system is a government agency, essentially. It's not really a private competitive business. It's a government agency with privileges granted by the government, the privilege of creating money, of directing spending. So the kinds of loans you make are, first of all, it's your responsibility to assess the borrower's ability to pay, but also you're in a privileged position. So, some peasant can't create money out of nothing, but a bank can. So the kind of interest you charge, the degree to which you abuse your ability to charge interest to begin with. These have been considerations for centuries, for probably more than centuries throughout history. And, that's where usury comes into play. That's where there's been usury laws. I think in the US, there was usury laws until the 1980s or something like that, if I'm not mistaken.
I can't comment on that. I don't know.
Yeah. But that's what this was about. It was about recognizing that the banking system is in a privileged position, a privileged monopolistic or oligopolistic position with special rights and privileges granted by the government. And so the loans they make, the interest they charge, they don't necessarily always come out of a competitive free market. They much rather come out of a position of hierarchy of, the banking system versus the peasants who had to borrow money to be able to buy and the machinery, or in ancient days, just very simplistic tools to work the fields.
In fact, hold that thought. It made me think of that. This is one of the openings to one of the chapters in Debt for the first 5,000 years. So this is
which chapter is it?
This is chapter 11, Age of the Great Capitalist Empires, page 307. 11 pesos then, as you can't pay me the 11 pesos, that makes another 11 pesos, 22 in all. 11 for the sarape and the patate, and 11 because you can't pay. Is that right, Crisiero? Crisiero had no knowledge of figures, so it was very natural that he said, "That is right, patron." Don Arnulfo, isn't my Spanish great? Don Arnulfo was a decent, honorable man. Other landowners were a good deal less soft-hearted with their peons. The shirt is 5 pesos, right? Very well. And as you can't pay for it, that's 5 pesos. And as you remain in my debt for the 5 pesos, that's 5 pesos. And as I shall never have the money from you, that's 5 pesos. So that makes 5 and 5 and 5 and 5. That's 20 pesos. Agreed? Yes, patron. Agreed. The peon can get the shirt nowhere else when he needs one. He can get the credit nowhere but from his master, for who he works and from whom he could never get away as long as he owes him a centavo. So,
yeah.
I think that illustrates very well what you just said, which is that the banking system, or just lending in general, the way money functions is like this arcane eldritch, weird understood thing not understood by the peasantry. And if you understand and you're like, okay, well, here's a loan for $10, but it's another $10 because you'll never be able to pay me back.
Right, and it gave me an interesting perspective on the economy as a whole, because we're always brought up with this idea the economy starts with two people trading. One has shoes, the other has chickens, so they're on equal footing and they just exchange goods of similar value. And so that's expanded is the economy as a whole, the free market economy. It's a beautiful system. We're all just exchanging goods and services. But the book Debt the First 5,000 Years has given me the impression that the entire history of the economy is actually more like people trying to put other people in debt all the time. Yes. And everything else just derives out of that. The money system comes out of that. And then what we do with the money, investing, buying things, goods, comes out of just people putting other people in debt. That's the primary driver for the economic system of the world, for the history of economics, essentially.
And to that point is that, okay, so is it a situation where the peon, this guy here, and the master are on equal footing because they have equal negotiation power? Or is it that the master really has a lot more, the peon doesn't know what's going on, and then the master could just make up whatever he wants to trick the guy into accepting a massive debt, and then he can never pay it off, and that's the end of it?
Well, and also the debts are the monetary debts and numbers and math. They make it all seem so neutral and so rational and so normal. But what's behind these numbers is weaponry and oppression and threats of violence and enslavement and all these things, like what you just said, the peon and the master, but also the indentured serf and the indentured servant and the master. These are all non-monetary. I mean, the weaponry, the oppression. These are non-monetary phenomena, but then the monetary system, the debt system, was created to make it seem more harmless, to make it seem more rational, more mathematical, more sort of disinterested. Just, well, these are the numbers, so this is what we have to do.
Right, and it's an equal playing field. It's a system where one entity or one group of entities controls the entire ebb and flow of how this money moves. However, when you interact with it, it's an equal playing field, right? Well, like we said before, if the government this is all set up with the government demands a tax, and then the government has to give you the method by which you could pay that tax, a way to get the token to pay the tax. So the whole thing's set up by the government and institutions close to the government, like the private banking system, and that if you end up in a situation where you're really screwed up because you didn't play that game right, okay, yes, it's your fault that you didn't play that game right, but who told you how to play the game? Other than weirdos like us who are trying to find people who know how to play the game and repeat it so other people can hear it, nobody knows how to play this game. Just like the dude who signed up for an impossible amount of debt to pay back.
Yeah, there has to be more of a recognition of the fact that there is this constant drive to make up excuses to put people in debt. Another anecdote that I just couldn't find it right now, but I'm just gonna go by memory, that Graeber cites in his book is about some Mesopotamian king or some Sumerian king who basically claimed that he owned some land that was occupied by some other king, right? And he needed a pretext to go to war to take over that land. So then what he did was he just calculated all the grains that he missed out on farming from that land, and then
plus their interest,
plus compounding interest over time, and it came up with a completely ridiculous sum.
Yeah, the trillions for ancient Sumeria or some ridiculousness like that.
Today would be like, okay, you owe me $500 quadrillion in debt now. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, there was never the intention of actually coming up with some rational figure that can be paid off. It was just created as a pretext for one king to go to war against the other king. Yes. So, he's not paying his debts. Let's go to war and let's smash him. Let's take back our land.
And then, the question naturally arises, why do we all need to be in debt? Again, going back to the student thing, right? Why do we need all these debts? Standing up from up top and looking down below and saying, okay, looking at the cosmos of the economy, why does everybody need to be in debt? If we understand that money creation is just a credit thing, and if we could create the money the right way and send it in the right directions, nobody should have to be in debt for something like this. And I think the answer you've already answered is that for the most of history, money systems have been garnered around how do we get as many people in debt as possible to turn them into slaves.
Mm-hmm. And to just make very convenient income without having to really, to do much.
Exactly. Well, and then bankruptcy laws have obviously. I didn't recognize the value of bankruptcy laws until I read this book. Right, because before bankruptcy laws, like I said, you couldn't pay your debt. Well, you just get to be a slave and you're done. The idea of a bankruptcy law flips it around, like Nima was saying earlier, onto the creditor side to force the creditor to assess whether or not this is a good lending risk, right? And so whatever criticism that we could have today of the current system, like the fact that we have bankruptcy laws is a massive, massive thing. And with the student debt specifically, and I guess alimony and child support are kind of sort of on this periphery, but with student debt specifically, because you can't bankrupt out of it, it's starting to look more and more like the ancient times. You can't, we're going to give you a debt that you can't pay off. And then because you can't pay it off, we're going to garnish your wages. You can't afford to get married. Maybe in this state you can't get your driver's license and whatever else they do to you when you can't pay the thing off. And especially when you recognize the fact that the government can go, yeah, you know what, just forget all of it. They can just snap their fingers and all the debts are free, and there isn't that big of a blowback. for it. Again, I would not want it. I would not want the Jubilee to happen without some sort of structural changes to prevent it from happening again. But again, like I said, the government regularly spends $1 zillion on world-destroying shit. You can't, free the most productive aspect of your society to be economically productive again.
Right. It's a way of basically making the peasants rebel against the peasants.
If everybody who's watching this now or recording could like, share, and subscribe it helps us out a lot.
Yeah.
I hate saying it, but it's just true.